Thank you, Patty. Thank you, Dean Marcella, for having me here today. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I see some faces that I saw in Cairo. Hi, guys. How's it going? So I'm really happy to be here today. When Dean Marcella told me that I'd be speaking for probably from 1 to 2:30, I was like, oh gosh, how am I going to fill up an hour and a half? What am I possibly going to say? And then as I sat and went through my notes and did some research, I discovered that I might actually need 3 times that amount of time to really get through the really important topics that we're going to be discussing here today. So I hope that it's not too lengthy for you. What I'm going to be doing is basically going through some of the legal concepts of international human rights law as related to climate change, talk a little bit about language that we use every day, talk about climate change refugees and what we can do as we move forward in the future. As many of you know, we are in between COP27 and COP28. COP27 was held in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, basically to highlight Africa's role in combating climate damage, as well as the impact that that damage will have on the continent as a whole. The next one, COP28, will be in Dubai, which is also going to be really interesting because the presidency of that conference is going to be chaired by the president of the country's oil and gas company, which is kind of ironic, but let's see how that pans out. Arguments have been made that you cannot talk about climate change unless you have the main instigators of climate change at the table. So we're going to talk about that here as well today. So I want to quickly go through some of the interesting things that have happened in the past 60 years regarding climate change and the legal structures that we have that we can use to talk about some of the legal issues that we need to address in order to effectively combat climate change as we move forward. I'm going to take off my glasses because I've reached that age where I can't really read with the glasses on. So I also want to thank the Center for Justice and Law today for having me here, and I hope that I don't mess up any of the legalese as I go forward. The core crimes of aggression, crimes against humanity, genocide, war crimes, and crimes of aggression that are listed in the Rome Statutes, Articles 6, 7, and 8 should include crimes against the environment. This is basically my premise here today, and should allow for the prosecution of individuals for criminal liability causing damage to the environment. The Rome Statute was considered a stepping stone to resolving many of the inadequacies of international criminal law. It established the International Criminal Court, which was itself inspired by the calls for justice following the Balkan Wars in former Yugoslavia in the early 1990s, and the massacres and atrocities committed in Rwanda in the wake of the Cold War. It is in the same spirit that the calls for climate justice must now be addressed in equal and proportional measures. International law fundamentally seeks to protect civilian populations from and prosecute the committing of inhumane acts intentionally causing great suffering or serious injury to the body or to mental or physical health. Why should we now be calling for crimes against the environment to be considered core crimes? Concern about the planet began to be addressed in international forums in earnest in June 1972 with the establishment of the United Nations Environmental Program, UNEP, at the Stockholm Conference. Since then, there have been about 69 related conferences, 60 related conferences, sorry. Despite the UN creating the Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, known as COP1 in 1995, there has been little progress made to gain global consensus on how we should combat climate change. It wasn't until COP26, some 25 years later, known as the Glasgow Pact, that some progress, not enough, many say, was made to agree to restrictions on man-made emissions. In the meantime, the negative effects of man-made climate change are beginning to be felt. Carbon emissions since 1950 have been steadily rising to their highest level in 400,000 years. We should pause to think about that. So in 400,000 years, planet Earth has not been as sick as it is now. Current international law is designed to protect civilian populations from numerous fallouts of war. And I emphasize the sentence, fallouts of war, which include murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, persecution on political, racial, national, ethnic, cultural, religious, gender, or other grounds, apartheid, arbitrary imprisonment, torture, rape, sexual slavery, enforced prostitution, forced pregnancy, enforced sterilization, or any other form of sexual violence. That also includes enforced disappearance of persons or other inhumane acts intentionally causing great suffering or serious injury to the body or to mental or physical health. Nowhere in this definition have you heard anything referring to the environment or climate change, or to the livelihood of people being associated with the environment and climate damage. Let us focus very briefly on the fallouts of war, as I mentioned. The International Commission of the Red Cross was born in the aftermath of the bloody battle for Solferino, Italy in June 1859. The United Nations, its International Court of Justice, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the Geneva Conventions were born from the ashes of World War II and the Holocaust. The International Criminal Court was born after the atrocities of the civil war in Yugoslavia and the genocide in Rwanda. It is a fact of history that war leads to the deaths of combatants and civilians, leads to dispossession, invasion, occupation, and creates several refugee crises throughout human history. But war is also so egregious that it fosters not only a system of international laws, but conventions and norms to protect civilians, ensure the rights of combatants, and establish what is acceptable in combat. It also, very critically, enables the prosecution of core crimes. This has been done through the creation of special tribunals, military or otherwise, to hear core crimes, to bring witnesses, to bring individuals and militias to face their accusers. To reiterate, core crimes include genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crimes of aggression. Terms like genocide and crimes against humanity became sad additions to the legal vernacular and sat at the table of international realpolitik in the past 50 years. But there is another war that is sometimes discussed in hushed tones in international hallways, one which is not even acknowledged to a great degree as a war because of purposeful semantics and contorted language. It's the war against the environment. And unfortunately, there are no prosecutions that apply to this crime or protections of planet Earth and the species which call it home. War is known to be man-made. It is deliberate and purposeful, usually the consequence of policy and direction. But the term climate change reveals no such man-made influence. Unless we specifically refer to it as man-made climate change, which is what we're really discussing here, the term could refer to natural climate change, the natural evolution of the planet, the natural changes, as you know, some weather patterns like El Nino and El Nino. The psychology of language is critical. History teaches, whether you're a STEM or a humanities student, the past paves the path to the future. But if crimes against humanity were born of past man-made transgressions, why too can we not expect, why too can we not expect similar legal devices today, born of past crimes against nature, and call those crimes crimes against the environment? Our past is rich with crimes against the environment, and the first I refer to is one of the worst man-made and deadliest crimes of the 20th century, which nearly 40 years later is still causing ecological ruin and death. On December 3rd, 1984, nearly 45 tons of a very powerful and toxic gas called methyl isocyanate was leaked into the air in Bhopal, India, and within 2 weeks killed at least 3,500 people. In the months after that, tens of thousands fell ill and died. Groundwater in Bhopal to this day remains toxic. The plant was owned and majority managed by Texas-based Union Carbide. Subsequent investigations revealed the gas was improperly stored and the plant was understaffed. The thousands of families who buried loved ones are still waiting for the American parent company to be held accountable, but no international legal norms exist which could take on such an environmental crime and prosecute the corporation or its top brass for criminal liability. Here's why. The Bhopal crime, while due to policies of the parent Texas-based corporation, occurred on Indian soil. There are those who feel that even though it happened in India, it is a transnational crime. A transnational crime is new nomenclature that we've been using in the fields of human justice and international law. It was formulated over the course of and due to technological developments and new political economic realities, such as globalization, for example. These transnational crimes have allowed once local criminals to expand and transcend borders so that they are at once domestic and international in nature. These crimes offend a fundamental value of the international community. Terrorism is probably the biggest transnational crime that comes to mind. It crosses borders and is the most atrocious type. For example, the terrorist group Boko Haram operates in Nigeria as well as most of Western Africa. Therefore, pursuing and prosecuting Boko Haram becomes an international responsibility. Now, if we look at crimes against the environment, the most atrocious of these are the discovery, mining, and recovery of fossil fuel energy sources. Most scientists around the world agree that energy companies bear the brunt of responsibility for crimes against the environment. According to CDP, a not-for-profit charity which provides comprehensive information on climate change and corporate environmental practices, 100 active fossil fuel producers, including ExxonMobil, Shell, BHP Billiton, and Gazprom, a Russian oil company, are linked to 71% of industrial greenhouse gas emissions since 1988. So basically, the mess that we're in today is largely due to these 100 fossil fuel producers not being held accountable and not maintaining safe practices. These companies are considered transnationals because they operate domestically and internationally. However, the transnational crimes they may commit do not yet have international jurisdiction or mechanisms to pursue and prosecute like terrorism does. They are therefore left to domestic courts to handle. Are the gas leaks and oil spills, the nuclear waste dumping, to be considered transnational crimes? No, not yet, but they should be. Current customary law holds that the prosecution of transnational crimes is undertaken by domestic legal systems rather than in international courts. To facilitate helping the domestic prosecution as well as to cooperate in the suppression of these crimes, sovereign nations have entered and ratified international agreements which foster prospective cooperation between them. Domestic courts prosecuting such crimes are influenced by international treaties and conventions, in addition to already possible existing customary law. These conventions, also known as suppression conventions, have been used since World War II to pursue and prosecute criminal activities such as human, organ, and weapons trafficking, terrorism, piracy, and trafficking of women. Suppression conventions engage with states to conclude and cooperate through the mechanisms of international agreements to suppress crimes. All of these features are seen to be in the agreements on terrorism and beyond, but not for crimes against the environment. In the Bhopal case, were India's courts, the domestic courts, equipped to ensure a fair and due process? Did India's courts have adequate procedural processes, including investigation and prosecution, to ensure a fair trial? Did the families have the means to be heard in the courts or to have competent legal representation? The answer is that many domestic courts may not have a system in place or fall to bribery and corruption. This therefore prompts victims to seek legal recourse elsewhere. In 1986, 2 years after the tragedy, Bhopal victims sought accountability in US courts. A federal judge ruled that lawsuits stemming from the lethal release of the chemical gas in 1984 should be heard in Indian courts and not in US courts where Union Carbide is based. He moved to dismiss billions of dollars in damage claims filed in US courts. In the ruling, to send the Bhopal matter back to India, the US district judge granted a motion filed by Union Carbide and rejected the position of the Indian government to seek legal recourse in the US. India had argued that its own legal system is unprepared to handle a matter of such magnitude. Now, the reason that I've traced this back to Bhopal and their efforts to find the parent company culpable of crimes against the environment is to show that the lack of international legal mechanisms is essentially giving such corporations, which are both national and transnational, a free ride. For crimes against the environment, we will always see transnational companies and the big energy juggernauts emerging victorious from the damage inflicted on the environment. Why? Considerable scientific research by NASA, the United Nations, and other research facilities around the world has found a common denominator in the causes of environmental damage. First off, natural disasters, although this may seem like an ironic misnomer since the catalyst has been human action, are and will continue to increase in gravity and toll. Rising sea levels are expected to swallow whole areas of population densities, threatening their modes of living by directly washing away agricultural resources. Massive migration and forced displacement will inevitably occur. The reference to forced here is no coincidence. It is to indicate congruence with similar references in the Geneva Conventions and the Rome Statute on forced displacement and expulsion. Just as air raids, invasions, and violent military action can force masses of people to be displaced because their livelihoods have been destroyed, and the biggest example that we're living with today is the Ukraine-Russia war, man-made environmental damage can lead to crop failure, flooding due to rising sea levels, drought, food and water insecurity, which then force once stable societies to be disrupted and displaced. Nowhere is this damage being more felt today than in Africa and Asia, impacting already stressed countries and populations which are among the most impoverished in the world. This displacement, the UN warns, is likely to be the cause of tension and future conflicts. Imagine when you have 2 million people leaving their homes and migrating southward or northward and coming to live in your neck of the woods, in your neighborhood. The access to resources is going to be much more limited. You're going to be overpopulated, tensions will rise, violence will rise, crimes will rise, and of course, this is what we mean by future conflicts. Therefore, special attention must be placed on water and food security, which will likely impact the Middle East and North African nations the most. We are already seeing tensions with the threat of war over two primary rivers, which go back to ancient times, the river Euphrates in Iraq, Turkey, and Syria, and the river Nile, which runs through Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia. An already dry region of the world is scorched summer after summer, with temperatures reaching 140 Fahrenheit. Now, this isn't fiction. This isn't a prediction of the future. It's actually happening right now. So they play that over in your mind. What would your life be like in MSP with 140 Fahrenheit temperatures? Will you be able to go to the mall? Will you be able to walk your dog? How will your life be at home? What energy usage must soar to compensate for such heat waves? Well, these are already happening in many countries in the Middle East and parts of Africa. A week before I arrived here, India was going through its own heat wave of 120 Fahrenheit, and several deaths were reported. And this is just April, so we haven't even hit the summer months. The Pacific Water Research Center at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia warns that it is recognized that climate change impacts, while in some cases acting as the primary cause of displacement, are a significant contributor to the destabilization of regions already compromised by poverty and political unrest. Our future, our combined human future, is a future of mass displacement and refugees. And who are these refugees? As in war, they will overwhelmingly be women, carrying their children on their backs as they desperately seek refuge from the impact of drought, diminishing agricultural returns, flooding, and salt water seeping into once mineral-rich ecosystems. They will be women of color, already impoverished, malnourished, and underprivileged. Just to give you an idea of how climate damage is already impacting some of the least developed nations. According to the World Economic Forum, it is predicted that 17% of Bangladesh's landmass will be submerged by the rise in sea level by 2050. That's just 26 years from now. And 20 million people living there will lose their homes. That's 12% of the population. In US terms, that would be 40 million Americans losing their homes due to flooding. As I'm speaking to you today, the Mississippi River is flooding. Some streets are blocked off. Some people have had to move. There are all these drills on what you should take if your house starts to flood. Take your cell phones with you so that you can call people that you need. There will be internal displacement due to man-made climate change in every country on Earth. No one will be immune. How will governments deal with this? Do they have policies in place? The answer is no. Do they have legal recourse to tackle these issues? The answer is no. To drive the point home further, talking about the least developed countries, climate change and climate damage has displaced 1.1 million people inside Afghanistan itself. Now, Afghanistan has been through wars for the past 50 years, 50-something years. It's been occupied by numerous countries, the Russians, then the Western allies. It's gone from socialist communist government to very restrictive Islamist extremist government. So it's had its fair share of problems. It has a weakened education system. Women are not allowed to go to school. It has a weakened food and security nexus. So this country, which has already been battered by history, now has to deal with 1.1 million internally displaced persons due to climate change. In India, nearly 1 million internally displaced persons will have to be accounted for and given subsistence just this year alone. So many questions come to the fore. Is an action that leads to the displacement and or death of thousands equal in criminal liability to forced expulsion and killing of thousands in war? Is there a parallel, for the sake of example, between actions in allowing the destruction of a public gathering place, such as a church, where thousands sought refuge, and this is an actual event that happened in Rwanda, a church housing refugees during the ethnic civil war there was burned down by a local warlord. Is there a parallel between such a criminal offense and the destruction of an ecosystem which will lead to the suffering and death of thousands? The answer must be yes. And this is where we introduce the term ecocide, a mixture of ecology and homicide. And it's no coincidence that we do that. The term ecocide has been floating around among advocates of a crime against humanity clause in the International Criminal Court and elsewhere for the past 20 years. Ecocide refers to actions that result in the willful, conscious destruction, this is very important, conscious destruction of the natural environment or ecosystem in a way that impacts human, animal, and plant life. So it's really important that we're not the only inhabitants of planet Earth. We are wiping out species after species every single day, and one day we will find that we too will be wiped out. Eco crimes are very much a field of international criminal law which is in development. But unlike the International Law Commission in the United Nations General Assembly, which took decades to reach a conclusion or consensus on how to define genocide or how to define decolonization, we do not have the luxury of time when it comes to crimes against the environment. We are living the impact of crimes against the environment today, every single day. Crimes against the environment must equal crimes against humanity, one of the core crimes. And planet Earth, a living, breathing system, must be considered a living being, a person. Once it's considered a person, it's afforded protections under international law. The legal material is already here if one resorts to the above equation of equating crimes against the environment to crimes against humanity. In international law, in international criminal law, to be more specific, we talk of complicity and liability, of things like foreseeability. So foreseeability, as the word indicates, is being able to anticipate the consequences of your actions. When corporations commit fracking or dredging of coral reefs for infrastructure projects, for tourism, or coal mining, which is determined to create pollutants which can lead to displacement and death, are they not complicit? Did they not have any scientific data to indicate what their actions would result in? Did they not have foreseeability of their actions or even inactions to protect the environment? And as such, should they not be held liable? Is willful polluting tantamount to willful killing? Can killing the environment be equal to killing persons? This requires much more enlightened thinking and dialogue than is currently happening right now. In fact, natural law stretching back several thousands of years does provide an intellectual, humanistic avenue to argue on behalf of the environment as a legal living entity. This would propel us decades ahead of our time, but it may be just willful thinking at the moment. I remain hopeful nonetheless. The provisions of Article 6 and 7 of the International Criminal Court, which I mentioned at the very beginning, the Rome Statute, currently include elements of what could form a future definition of crimes against the environment. While Article 6A provides an intellectual argument for a crime against the environment, Article 6B specifically refers to genocide by causing serious bodily or mental harm. Article 6C focuses on genocide by deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction. Crimes against the environment should be seen as existing core crimes. They presently exist as subsets of these crimes of aggression and crimes against humanity. What may immediately come to mind is the use of biological and chemical weapons used against civilian populations and infrastructure in international and non-international armed conflict. These may be used as a means to prosecute genocide because the underlying definition here is that chemical weapons or such weapons were used to destroy an existing group of people. However, willful action by an armed group or party to a conflict against another armed group or party can also lead to direct or indirect collateral damage or destruction of agricultural lands or other such ecosystems. We see this in almost every single conflict since the end of World War II, collateral damage to agricultural lands, housing, livelihoods of people who are then forced to move elsewhere. I want to talk very briefly to you about one such actual crime that was committed in the 1980s, but many of you might not have even heard about because it really didn't go beyond the scope of the United Nations. The Iraqi marshlands. So during the Iraq War with Iran in 1980 to 1988, the Iraqi military, under the direct orders from then President Saddam Hussein, drained the marshlands, which dated to prehistoric times. They were even mentioned in the Bible. They were drained to prohibit Iranian soldiers from hiding there. The result was the destruction of an ecosystem which had provided a way of life and sustainability to the Arab tribes of southern Iraq for thousands of years. This was a direct human action which led to the end of the Arab marshlands, and which the United Nations Environment Program described as one of the world's greatest environmental disasters. The possibility of ecocide to stand shoulder to shoulder with genocide as a heinous crime recognized by the ICC is a human rights imperative, one that will impact future generations and propel international criminal law forward. We need to be progressive and inclusive of the human condition. Legal expert and law professor David Lubin says the term crimes against humanity suggests offenses that aggrieve not only the victims and their own communities, but all human beings, regardless of their community. This description came in the wake of and was derived from the horrors of World War II. Famed human rights historian and philosopher Hannah Arendt, writing about the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem, refers to the Holocaust as a new crime, the crime against humanity, in the sense that a crime was committed against the human status, or very much against the very nature of mankind. These words are not coincidental. She states that a crime against humanity is perpetrated not only on the victims, but on the whole human community, all of mankind. And this is what we are all facing today. Man and womankind, we are all facing extinction due to current policies or lack thereof. Are such crimes perpetrated then not only on the victims, but also on the whole of mankind? The answer is yes. Arguably, all human beings share an interest in suppressing grave acts of environmental destruction, an interest that may well justify making such acts international crimes, and that's what I'm calling for here today. There is progress, so it's not all very bleak, but the progress is painstakingly slow. During the UN Conference on Human Environment in 1972, so we're talking 50 years ago, 51 years ago, protection of the planet was discussed, and yet nothing has happened, right? There are no policies that are protecting the planet. We're only chasing companies and governments to curb carbon emissions, unsuccessfully, I may add. The protection and environment of the human environment, the protection and improvement of the human environment is a major issue, which affects the well-being of people and economic development throughout the world. It is the urgent desire of all peoples of the world and the duty of all governments. This is very critical as well. It is the duty of every government on this planet to have a significant policy to curb climate damage and protect the environment, not just for the physical geographic area that government occupies, but for the entire planet. What happens in Zanzibar will affect what happens in Australia and so on. The activists who organized the conference called for the creation of a universal declaration of the rights of Mother Earth. This was inspired by the UN General Assembly's creation in 1948 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is why I've been going through all these legal parameters. And more importantly, they also asked for a tribunal to prosecute offenses against the environment and those who contribute to climate change. The UN's Human Rights Council on October 8, 2021, passed a non-binding resolution confirming the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. This is critical, even though it's non-binding, because it sets up the language that if you are not given a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment in which to grow and raise a family and meet economic development, then that is a violation of your human right. This is very groundbreaking language, and it gives hope for the future that one day this might become a binding resolution. That resolution says that environmental damage has negative implications for the effective enjoyment of all human rights, and that environmental erosion is a pressing threat. I would say it's not a pressing threat, it's a reality. More recently, climate justice activists have grown bolder and challenging the big energy companies. In an upcoming issue of the Harvard Environmental Law Review Journal, a paper to be published in 2024 titled Climate Homicide: Prosecuting Big Oil for Climate Deaths says it is time to use the mounting evidence to pursue and prosecute as homicide those individuals and corporations whose reckless or negligent acts or emissions cause unintentional deaths. They should be prosecuted as well for the misdemeanors or felonies that cause these unintentional deaths due to a lack of action on climate damage. Fossil fuel companies learned decades ago that what they produced, marketed, and sold would generate globally catastrophic climate damage in the years to come. It has never been enough that corporations found liable are made to financially compensate victims. You can't eat the money that you're getting. Their crimes must be labeled homicide. Crimes against the environment are what we are today calling ecocide. They must be prosecuted and found guilty, whether it's an entire corporation, whether it's the CEO, or whether it's a particular individual. Once this begins to happen, you will see much more accountability in some of these companies. More recently, a Swiss court refused to hear a case brought by 2,000 women who claimed their government's policies in Switzerland had failed to protect them from rising temperatures in the summers. They were claiming that the significant surge in temperatures that we've seen over the past few years in many countries in Europe, including Switzerland, had been causing a lot of deaths among the elderly. The Swiss court tossed the case out 6 times. So for 6 years, these 2,000 women consolidated their energies and kept trying to convince the Swiss government and the Swiss courts to hear this case, but they failed. So they did the next smart thing. They turned to the European Court of Human Rights. This is the first time in human history and European history that the European Court of Human Rights will hear a case on the impact of climate change on human rights. This has groundbreaking implications, but it is not enough. Crimes against the environment must be added as core crimes alongside genocide. It is sad that the Bhopal case that I mentioned in 1984 didn't create the momentum necessary at the time to move in this direction. As the world prepares for COP28, isn't it time that we did that? In the 2004 movie, The Day After Tomorrow, which I hope many of you have seen, we see thousands of Americans make the journey as refugees into Mexico to escape a polar vortex which deep freezes much of North America. At the time, audiences may have laughed at the irony of refugees moving southward, but that laughter will be a pale echo of what once was, as every person in this room, your neighbors, your children, and if they survive, your children's children, become climate refugees, consistently on the move, looking for food to grow in a region which has been pummeled by drastic weather patterns. Everyone's going crazy over AI, with some saying it will wipe out humanity. No, Habibi, we did that by ourselves. A recent report says that planet Earth will fix itself, will self-clean like your devices that you have at home, will clean itself of pollutants from the air. I have absolutely no doubt that this is true. Planet Earth will clean itself, and it will be amazing to watch, because the greatest pollutant on planet Earth is humanity itself. Yes, it will self-clean by removing humanity from the equation. The experiment known as humanity will soon come to an end if drastic action is not taken. So what can we do? I don't have answers. I just have hopes. Plant as many trees as you can and hope they have mercy on us. Thank you.
What questions or thoughts do folks have this time? What to hear from?
So the European Court on Human Rights, the case with the Swiss women, that's ongoing right now?
Yes, it is.
Okay, and when is that, like what is that process of that court? I'm not familiar with it.
So basically, the court is going to review scientific evidence to support what the women have been saying. And they would probably look back on the last 20 years or so of average temperatures that have been recorded in Switzerland, and look at how that correlates with extra deaths. By extra deaths, I mean the deaths that aren't anticipated to happen, but happen due to unnatural reasons. And that will probably provide the biggest body of evidence. I think they will also refer to NASA scientific data. So NASA, while we all assume that NASA works in putting out, putting vehicles on surface of planets and so on, it also does a lot of research on planet Earth, rising seawater, the temperatures of bodies of water, and so on. So they will definitely resort to that, as well as the European Space Agency's own data. I feel like this case has global implications, because they will also look at other communities and how those communities are suffering. But you can bet that the Swiss government is going to put up one hell of a fight, because what we're talking about here is not only compensation in terms of millions and billions of dollars, but also forcing the Swiss government to change its policies regarding mitigating climate damage. So this is going to be a really interesting case to follow. I'm glad you asked that question. It's a very good question. Thank you.
I was thinking about kind of the rights of nature movement, which you've talked about a little bit, and I was just kind of looking a couple things up while you were talking, and I thought folks might be interested in hearing that. So the rights of nature movement, are you comfortable kind of giving an overview of what that is?
Well, it's basically looking at planet Earth as a living ecosystem, which is directly influenced by our actions and influences our actions at the same time. It's a very humanistic approach. One would even say that it's an approach that was adopted by communities, pre-industrial age communities, whereby the cutting down of trees was only for necessity, like to build homes. The hunting of animals was done only for food and sustenance and their fur and so on. And so basically it really goes back to make not waste kind of approach. I'm not very familiar with them per se, but they are adopting what a lot of indigenous groups around the world have been calling for many years. One group that does come to mind, which fits this bill, are the indigenous tribes of the Amazon rainforest. So during COP27, they were very visible. They came in their their headdresses and so on, and of course the media had fun covering that story. But what really lies at the heart of that is that the Amazon rainforest is being cut down so quickly, while the Brazilian government has vowed to plant more trees, it's not doing so at a sufficient rate. And the reason that they're cutting down forests, the Amazon rainforest is critical to human life because of the chemical processes which filter carbon dioxide and give us the air that we breathe. They're basically cutting these down to make room for grazing of cattle. So there's an equally strong movement that's saying, stop eating meat. That'll save the environment. Of course, there are also some jokes that are sometimes made about too many cows passing wind and methane gas, and that's also contributing to global warming. It's scientifically true, but I don't think it's as significant as the fact that we have carbon gas emissions from some of these fossil fuel companies.
I was kind of looking at how, so there's just a few specific bodies of water that are currently have been granted personhood, which gives them certain rights, I guess, although again, not really binding. And another thing that the rights of nature movement is doing is they've gathered a coalition of 50 countries, and they're planning to present a treaty for negotiation at the UN meeting on conservation of biodiversity, I think this fall. I don't know, is that before or after COP28?
COP28 will be in November.
Okay, yeah, so I think it's before that. But that's only 50 countries that are planning on putting that are in that coalition.
And more importantly, whatever resolution they pass is going to be non-binding,
Yeah.
and will have no impact on what governments around the world will produce in terms of mitigating climate damage. I mean, it's good to have there. It's good in terms of the scientific research that's going to be presented. It's good to share with the public, which could maybe spur some kind of action, pressuring local governments before getting to federal governments and so on. It's a step in the right direction, but unfortunately, if it's not the governments themselves that are contributing to this and participating in it, it's pretty much not going to end well.
So you mentioned tensions over water sources. I have been paying attention to a lot of this stuff because I see the Ukraine war is starting, or at least the most recent section of the invasion started with wanting to control some of the canal that originally brought water to Crimea. You also mentioned Egypt and Ethiopia. They have tensions there, and also Turkey and Iraq. Is there any like methods that could like mediate between a lot of these parties to prevent a lot of this conflict? Because I see a lot of these things happening, and I see more political instability coming with the conflict over water rather than a trend towards stability where people are like, we need to ration this water, we need to, you know, understand all of our needs. I guess it's just been kind of unnerving for me to be watching this happen.
It's a very good question. Part of that answer lies in how sovereign nations deal with one another, and I'll put it in quotes, respect that they afford each other. So the way that international law works is that sovereign nations cannot be made to do anything unless they've entered into a treaty with either a two-party treaty or a multi-party treaty, in which case, if they fail to live up to the tenets of the treaty, they can be taken to the International Court of Justice, for example, which would arbitrate. But again, it's not binding and can't be enforced. But most countries of the world tend to invest a lot in their reputations and in the way that they deal with the international community. So that does have somewhat of an impact. Now, I can tell you in terms of the Nile water and the building of the Great Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia and what's been happening over the past several years. In 2011, a video was leaked in which an Egyptian member of parliament said that if the Ethiopians don't acquiesce to Egyptian demands on the construction of the dam, then we will simply send out our Air Force to blow it up. So this was a leaked video. Of course, Egypt would not do that. This was just one errant member of parliament, but it did cause a domino effect in terms of the African Union, the United Nations, and the United States Secretary of State intervening to mediate between Egypt, Sudan, because the Blue Nile runs through Sudan, so Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia, to find ways to address the concerns of all these countries. So Egypt and Sudan had been pretty much dependent on pre-1950s British colonialist contract about how much each country should get in terms of their share of the Nile water. Ethiopia argued, well, we are a growing population. It's no longer the 1950s. We have needs, economic needs. We want to power our communities and so on. So the arguments of all parties in this case, sadly, are valid, and they can't seem to agree. So far, the GERD Dam is continuing with construction. Every year they flood it in the summer to test it. There have been no real repercussions, but many regions and areas in Sudan tend to flood because of GERD, and that right there causes forced migration of people, right? And the end of their livelihoods, agricultural land. South Sudan, Southern Sudan, both are very rich in agricultural lands. So this is already causing a problem. I do not see all-out war happening because it's in no one's real interest. It'll cause much more damage than anything. But there are efforts to mediate. These efforts, unfortunately, don't come with the strong stick approach, right? So you all know about the carrot and stick approach. So in this particular case, the only body that can wield that stick would be the United Nations Security Council. It has issued a number of warnings and called for all parties to mediate and to sit down at the table, but it hasn't taken action other than that. But we do see conflict erupting in other parts. So for example, the 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon was really about access to water. One reason why Jordan signed a peace treaty with Israel in the 1990s was because it's a very landlocked country. The only access it has to water is through the port of Aqaba and the Dead Sea, which is very high saline content. And so if it remained in a state of perpetual war with Israel, it would have seen a lot of its agricultural lands dry up. What I do know is that Israeli agricultural scientists tend to visit some of the countries that they have good relations with in the region, Arab countries, and share agricultural science with these countries. So for example, drip technology, if you've heard of drip technology, it's to minimize the use of water as irrigation. So it's metal rods hanging over seeded areas which drip every now and then, rather than just flush out water. So, but that's, I mean, water security is a huge issue in Middle East and North Africa, and I just hope it doesn't come to war. But you know, there will be individual communities that will move and encroach on other communities, and you'll see these more limited conflicts erupt. Thank you. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so my question is, what types of resources, authority, and organization would international organization need in order to find success in defining and enforcing crimes against the environment?
Well, you need a good legal team for starters, right? So, you know, some communities have hired some of the biggest names in the legal industry, but these don't really matter if you don't have the legal precedents to pursue these issues on a global scale, not on a limited scale. So when I talked about India and the United States, because there is no international court that will hear India's appeal, it was sent back to India to deal with, regardless of how good a legal team they had. So what I think the biggest step is to really pressure existing legal to pressure courts like the International Court of Justice to, while it doesn't issue any forceful or binding resolutions, it does carry a lot of weight. The International Criminal Court, for individual groups and NGOs to really have to campaign at these COP meetings and other meetings to start to consider crimes against the environment as punishable crimes, crimes that carry criminal liability, and to include them as core crimes. So a good legal team, a number of academics, young people around the world are really mobilized because they are probably much more enlightened than older generations, because they're the ones that understand that this is a threat to their future, a threat to their livelihoods. So activism is very important. So when you see a convergence of all of these at the same time, that's when you start to see results. There are some sympathetic governments around the world that could possibly push this in legal hallways, such as the United Nations General Assembly or the Security Council. Finland, for one, I think is very progressive in its economic approach. New Zealand, there are some countries that are currently sinking into the sea, such as the Maldives Islands. A few years ago, their prime minister held a cabinet meeting underwater to illuminate and show people, basically, I mean, it was a publicity stunt, but it was also basically to show that, you know, in 20 years, this is where we'll be holding our cabinet meetings, because the islands are sinking. So all of these need to come together. There are discussions happening. There is momentum right now. That's why I say I'm a bit optimistic, but we're running out of time. I mean, you're seeing crazy weather patterns. I just came from Toronto. They had a heat wave, 3 days of plus 90-degree weather in April. It was it beat all the records that they've had over the past 70 or so years. Here you're having lower than normal temperatures now. So we're going to see this fluctuation back and forth. And what that does is it wreaks havoc with the vegetation, which is used to the very precise demarcation of seasons. So should the flowers bloom right now? Yes, no, is it gonna snow? You know, you're expecting freezing rain today, but you had sun last week. So yeah, so it's basically a convergence of all these groups coming together, really resorting to the science that's already out there. And I think one critical aspect is to really get the media on board. So now the media, what can I say about the media? They're not doing their homework. I mean, when was the last time you switch on TV or scroll down on your phones and saw some alarming or informational news tidbit about the environment? Nothing. Well, I mean, every time I switch on the TV here, it's DeSantis, Trump, I don't know what. So we're wasting our time talking about these smaller issues compared to what is really a bigger issue. Because even if Trump does become president, you know, in 4 years, what's he going to do for the environment? Nothing. He'll pull the US out again, right? So that is a critical point. But the world is boiling. So 15 years ago, we were trying to minimize the rise in temperatures by the end of the century to 1.5 degrees centigrade, right? Now they're talking about trying to keep it under 3 centigrade. And there's some scientists are saying, all this is bogus. What's really going to happen is the world is going to cook by you know, year 2100, we're going to see 5 degrees centigrade higher temperatures around the world. That's the global average. Tens of thousands of species of plant life and animal life and insect life will be completely wiped out. And you know, we're all connected. So I'm sure you've heard about the drastic drop in bees around the world, right? So imagine if bees stop. I mean, they're no longer around. Who's going to pollinate, right? And so it's all connected. But the media needs to come on board. The media needs to stop playing this stupid agenda game, right? And it's all done because corporations control the media and they think about the bottom line and how they're going to make money. Let's focus on something that's entertaining and maybe is creating complete mindless drones of young people rather than teach them what's really happening in the world. So the media, I think, is possibly as culpable as some of these big corporations. And I come from the media, but I'll be the first to admit that. Not me, but.
I have a follow-up question on media, so maybe this is a good moment. I saw the the Schumacher Center webinar a few weeks ago, and I saw in their newsletter last night that Jerry Mander made an argument against television, basically that we needed to get rid of television. We should have a moment of media reform ideas. So my question is partly about media reform, and it's partly about the International Criminal Court, what you said about Articles 6 and 7. So, and the gist of the question is with both, like, what are some of the steps that would get us to a more substantive media or to less crime? Because I understand, so for example, with Bhopal, I think this is useful for people to understand. When this was covered and tried, not only did it not create a precedent of responsibility, stock prices of helium carbide went up rather than down. It's considered to be a test to say, oh, international crimes, like this transnational crime, is unprosecutable. We can invest in, I mean, those chemicals in question are risky agricultural chemicals. They're made in contexts like that because there aren't policies requiring stricter health and safety requirements, basically. So, and as I understand it, the problem with a lot of these international environmental crimes is that they need a national context to be prosecuted in. And as long as somebody has a financial interest, for example, in mining, you're not going to hold Exxon or some other mining entity responsible because they would then not be invested in it. So what are some of the steps that can move us toward more responsible media or less corporately controlled media or a more responsive judiciary?
Well, if I can,
Whichever parts of that you want to
well, I think campaign finance reform is critical here, because how many of these corporations and groups, even individuals, lobby politicians on a daily basis, who will go to Congress or the House and make completely asinine comments about things that really are working toward your detriment ultimately. So you have to question, how are they that stupid? No, they're not that stupid, but they want to line their pockets, right? And so this is one big thing. So media focusing on campaign finance reform, of course, that is part of the media, because the media is part of that campaign financing. These ads, how many billions of dollars are spent on ads every single year? And how much do you get out of these ads? How many of you here vote? How many of you here vote? Okay. And how many of you have voted based on these ads that you watch on TV? Who's voted based on these ads? Don't, that's okay. No one. So what do you base your vote on? What? Color? Okay. I mean, where do you get the information? So basically what the media is supposed to do is, the media is in your service. Okay. So newspapers, online magazines, whatever, Fox, CBS, they all are there to service you. And how do they service you? By providing you with the information that you will on a daily basis use to make informed decisions. And these informed decisions have the utmost impact when it comes to the most democratic of processes, which is voting, right? So you will vote for a mayor, you will vote for a town sheriff, you will vote for whatever based on this information that you get from the media. Now, a lot of these media companies are controlled by corporations like General Electric, for example, and a few Viacom, and so on and so on. And who do they support, right? Who does the board there support? And how much do they contribute to campaign financing? So it's all this kind of vicious circle. And how do you break out of it? I don't know. There are all these democratic principles and safeguards in the Constitution that in the U.S. Constitution that are always being manipulated, twisted, redefined, reinterpreted to keep these power-hungry mavericks in power. And basically it's one thing supports, it's like a domino effect, right? Each domino protects and supports the other. So when one falls, you'll see them all falling. So to answer your question, the media is no longer what it was. So I grew up reading about the Bernsteins and Woodwards of the world who, through the power of investigative reporting, were able to unseat a sitting president. So Richard Nixon, following 2 years of investigations by the Washington Post and to a lesser degree, the New York Times, was forced to resign because of fraud and corruption, and he was committing crimes. And the committee to re-elect Nixon, which was called CREEP, ironically, right? The committee to re-elect the president, basically. These two journalists were harassed and intimidated, had an anonymous source, a whistleblower, who was elevated to heroic status. Now whistleblowers are criminally charged, right? So you have the Mannings and the Assanges of the world, right, who have brought forth misconduct and crime, are being prosecuted. And they fed the media a lot of information that the media was very happy to receive. And now no one in the media is even saying, well, hang on a second, what happened to anonymous sources and access to information? So I'm sorry to say that while the media is not necessarily dying, it is on life support. And it really depends on what you all do once you graduate from here, what you want to do with your lives, those of you who want to go into journalism. So right now it's all about what Kim Kardashian is wearing, who got what Botox in their lips. I don't know who's dating who broke up with who, Beyonce's charity organizations. I mean, this is all just fluff, and it's used to create like a generation of young people that are not accustomed to anything else. I know a lot of journalists, a lot of really respected academics who are calling and supporting long form journalism, investigative pieces, which are in depth and uncover the truth of what's going on. So I know a lot of university journalism departments in the US and around the world are starting to recover from this kind of mindless Walking Dead zombie mentality. So again, I remain hopeful about that because there will eventually be a backlash. You know, at some point, all of you are going to say, I don't want to read about, Justin Bieber doing what and who he's dating and so on. I want to know what's going on in my neighborhood and why are electricity prices so high? Why is inflation so high? What's being done to curb that? And these are the things that impact you on a daily basis. Yes.
Now I'm thinking about kind of accountability mechanisms for media outlets. For example, are there any legal efforts being made to hold certain, let's just say, news outlets responsible for reporting what is actually not factual information, specifically about climate-related issues, as an example? Are there any legal processes in place for accountability for that, or just?
No, because 15 years ago, climate damage and the whole issue of what we're talking about here today was considered a hoax by a lot of people, including scientists who unfortunately, and I don't want to be partisan here because I don't really care about the Republicans or the Democrats, but unfortunately we're in the Democratic camp. And that's why you see Trump withdrawing from the Paris climate conference once he became president. Actually, it was like the second day of his presidency that he started working on this. There are none because, well, there are, okay, you all heard what happened to Fox News, right? So Fox News has to pay almost $800 million in damages to one of the voting mechanism companies, and they're also being sued for $2.5 billion in a related case. That has moved very quickly. Why? Because it's political. It's not social, right? And so who's behind pushing the wheels of this investigation and this culpability? So again, it's really what the people in power tend to do. And I don't know if any of you have seen the movie V for Vendetta or read the graphic novel, right? But there's a very famous line which says that people shouldn't be afraid of their governments. Governments should be afraid of their people, because you're the ones who vote them in and out of power, right? And you're the ones who call for change. So unfortunately, there isn't. I mean, there are libel laws and slander laws, and we see that, usually when I don't know, when they say Brad Pitt is gay, for example, and he takes whatever newspaper or magazine to court and he gets damages, that's the only time that I've seen that happen. Of course, there are some journalists who fabricate sources or stories. Lawsuits are filed against them and they're fired. But on a grander scale, I haven't seen anything.
What other questions do people have? Or observations? Or
I have a question for the group, which is how many people read hyper-local media? I was just thinking in Minneapolis, there's a blogger named Andy Pittler who aggregates all the elections. Like basically every local politician's platform puts it all together, which is a really interesting example of independent journalism. Do you read the papers for your neighborhood or Oracle? I'm curious because what I'm seeing in the world of investigative journalism, at least in the Midwest, is a shift toward independent channels that are being philanthropically or locally supported. But that feels like a key for a larger shift that's sustainable and long. I'm curious what the field of journalism will be in 5 or 10 years. It could be really different.
Well, does anyone here read any news pieces, anything to do with news, investigative pieces? Yeah. I know you do.
When you think about the TikTok generation, the generation gets the information from. So that could be the issue. So when we focus on climate change, maybe we seem to focus very narrowly on the fossil fuel industry, but oftentimes we tend to ignore the problems of hyper-consumption that's consuming a lot of energy and different sources of the energy. So when you look at, only TikTok and focus only on certain aspects, that could be the real issue of something that we should actually think.
I just want to give an argument for the side of social media. I don't undermine what you said. There is an energy drain that comes from technology that is generally undermined. But there is worth to social media that traditional news media doesn't have, because traditional news media is falling into this pit of wealth and trying to earn money. Well, in some ways, social media can actually escape that, because it's to an extent individuals using a platform and using that platform to teach others. It also doesn't, like, again, there's problems with both sides of it, but I just want to also put that out there.
What are they teaching others?
And that depends. There are people using social media as a platform to try to present news and try to present even like neighborhood events like we were talking about before. And social media can also be used just like normal media can to mislead as well.
Yeah.
But that's also violating the international laws, because we bombing the Congo to mine the cobalt to make all the phones that everybody's using.
There's definitely like individual consumption based, and also like, I don't know, like kind of like carbon footprints and stuff, is like creating that BP. So like both of them need it, you know?
Well,
There's a question
I
there.
think the large problem with social media is I guess I find a problem with large lack of citation that a lot of people have on there. It's not normal to cite things on social media, and not to say a lot of it's restricted to just academia, but it's like, oh, you have to belong for bibliographies. You can't just cite your sources in a social media post, because on Twitter, oh, you gotta keep your characters limited. So I think social media is adapted. It could be much more useful, but it needs to be adapted. There needs to be more transparency, like the algorithms in the background. Because I know a lot of social media companies, they're just like a news company that can pull levers in the background. But certain things up at the top. But other things,
It's the AI.
yeah.
Well, you said something there. You said tool. So a tool is basically a tool. What you choose to do with it is really the name of the game here. So if you want to misdirect, if you want to disinform or misinform, you could totally do that. And it's been done, and we've seen that happen. If you want to call people out on their misinformation, you could totally do that as well. If you want to be a citizen journalist and talk about, like, rising Mississippi River or whatever, you could do that as well to raise awareness. So it's a tool, and it depends on your intent. You had a question?
Yeah, I kind of wanted to jump in on the conversation about social media. I think it's really good at getting at a lot of different individual issues, whereas I think news sources tend to keep it more broad just to get more issues out there. But something that I don't like about social media is that when you're looking for these specific issues, you tend to get stuck in the algorithm, and you keep scrolling, you keep finding these stories, and it can be really mentally draining on you. Yeah, doom scrolling. It's just, I wish there was a way that we could get all the information that we need in a way that the algorithm doesn't kind of make it to where you don't even want to look for it, because you keep seeing it. You'll just feel like you can't do anything about it.
Well, what search engine do you use?
I check on like TikTok.
Okay.
Like if I want to know about issue, I'll search for the issue, I'll see a few videos about it. And then after that, you just keep, because it seems that you wanted to see those videos, so it keeps showing videos. And after a certain point, you're like, social media is supposed to be a place to kind of not be looking for these, just look at funny videos or whatever. And then it becomes kind of a mix, and it just, I don't know, like when you're scrolling, you're kind of looking for relaxing videos, and then you're hit with very emotionally charged video. It can be kind of draining, but it's also like social media is a good place to find these specific issues, and you do want to look for them. I don't know, maybe it'd be good for resources to kind of have their own little TikTok for these, I don't know, specific stories. That would be just for that.
Well, don't let Biden hear you.
Can I ask a follow-up question of the class? So for those of you who's reading Ministry for the Future, there's a thought experiment here, because so in Ministry for the Future, one of the things that happens is that the social media platforms are by and large replaced by something called your lock, in which individuals own their own data. So I'm curious, and part of the premise there is the idea that if you can change some of the conditions of possibility, you're shifting some of the structures to reduce that corporate capture of attention. I'm curious if any of you think that would be a plausible set of nudges to change the direction that we've been hearing. Like, what about that is better? Because part of what's interesting is, all these people who are behind the scenes doing AI and journalism are saying, this will be different, this will be different. And at least in the premise of the book, as soon as people realize that their data is being sold without their consent, that they are the ones who get to choose whether their data is sold, and then they get some income from it, it changes the way they invest their information infrastructure.
But most users never read terms and conditions because they are 40 pages long. They just click accept on their phone and then download the app.
And I will say that's what the GDPR and the EU is sort of bearing out. That although you can set up more controls, whether or not people will take advantage of them, really is a literacy question
And an accessibility question.
That's critical. Digital literacy is very, very important. And I think, unfortunately, academic institutions around the world are coming around to that, but rather slowly. So students who already graduate might not have the necessary digital know-how to navigate this crazy data-infested landscape, which is really, really dangerous because it goes back to what you're talking about, misinformation and believing what's out there. And you were talking about TV, and so in the early days when TV became part of the living room architecture and really became another member of the household, or working families would put their kids in front of the TV. Everything that was coming out of the TV was, I don't want to use the word brainwashing us, but was really creating a completely mediated society. And to the point where a lot of people say, oh, it must be true, I saw it on TV. And then other phrases like getting their 15 minutes of fame, which is to appear on TV. And so like in the 80s and 90s, sometimes you'll see a meteorologist out in the street covering a flood or something, and there are all these kids running around behind him because they want their 15 minutes or 15 seconds of fame. If they make it on TV, that's it. They made it in life. So every new generation has the dangers and advantages of the new communication tool at their dispense. I don't know what's going to happen with AI. Everyone's talking about it now, and I just feel that the intensity of how many people are talking about it, it makes me feel like this is a diversion tactic from something else. Everyone's talking about AI, AI. Right, so.
Thank you so much.
Thank
for
you,
being
thank
here.
you, thank you, everyone. Thank you.